Most people don't fail because they're weak. They fail because they never decide who they are. Ethan Carter stood on the sidewalk outside a glass office building, holding a thin envelope in his hand, already knowing what it said before he even opened it. The same polite rejection he had seen too many times before. The same words that quietly told him he wasn't good enough, not experienced enough, not confident enough, just not enough. And as cars passed by and people walked with purpose around him, he felt stuck in place, like his life had stopped moving while everyone else kept going. And without thinking, he crumpled the envelope slightly in his hand, then slowly let it fall into the trash beside him, his shoulders heavy, his thoughts louder than the city noise, telling him the same thing they always did, that maybe this was just who he was, someone average, someone forgettable, someone who would never really become anything. And as he turned to leave, his eyes caught something small near the edge of the sidewalk, a short, worn-out pencil lying on the ground, its tip broken, its body scratched and dull, something most people would step over without a second thought. But for some reason Ethan stopped, staring at it longer than he expected, and after a moment he bent down and picked it up, turning it slowly between his fingers, noticing how light it felt, how useless it seemed, and yet something about it felt familiar, like he was looking at a reflection of himself, worn down, unfinished, and unsure of what it was even meant to do anymore. And just as he was about to toss it away, a calm voice behind him said, "Funny thing about pencils, they only become useful after they're willing to be sharpened." Ethan turned and saw an older man sitting quietly on a nearby bench, his posture relaxed, his eyes steady and thoughtful, as if he had been watching Ethan the entire time. And the man gave a small, knowing smile, then added, "But most people never let that happen." And Ethan frowned slightly, confused and a little annoyed, because to him it was just a broken pencil, nothing more, nothing worth thinking about. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper in those words, something he didn't fully understand yet. And as he stood there holding that small, broken object in his hand, he had no idea that this simple moment, this random encounter, was about to change the way he saw himself forever. The old man slowly stood up and walked closer, his steps calm and unhurried, as if time did not rush him the way it rushed everyone else. And he pointed gently at the pencil in Ethan's hand and said, "Tell me something. Do you think that pencil became useless the moment it broke?" Ethan hesitated, looking down at it again, the rough edges, the missing tip, and he replied quietly, "It looks like it did." The old man nodded slightly, not agreeing, but not disagreeing either, and then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out 2 more pencils, placing all 3 in Ethan's hand, one brand new and untouched, perfectly smooth and never used, one carefully sharpened with a clean, precise tip, and the one Ethan had found, short and broken. And the old man said, "I want you to keep these for 3 days." Ethan looked confused, his brows tightening as he tried to understand. "Why would I do that?" he asked, and the man smiled gently, the kind of smile that felt like it knew something. Ethan did not. "Because in 3 days, you will tell me which one you are." The words landed softly, but they stayed, and before Ethan could ask anything else, the old man stepped back and sat down again on the bench, closing his eyes as if the conversation was already finished, and Ethan stood there, holding the 3 pencils, feeling slightly ridiculous, part of him wanting to just walk away and forget about it. But another part of him, quieter but stronger, told him not to, so he slipped the pencils into his jacket pocket and began walking home, the weight of them strangely noticeable with every step. And that night, as he sat at his small kitchen table, the city lights glowing faintly through the window, he placed the 3 pencils in front of him and stared at them. The untouched one looked perfect, full of potential, but it had never written a single word. The sharpened one looked ready, shaped, useful, but it had clearly gone through pressure to become that way. And the broken one, it looked like it had a story, like it had tried and failed, like it had been something once and then stopped. And Ethan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, thinking about his own life, about all the times he had started something and quit halfway, all the opportunities he had let slip because he doubted himself, all the moments he chose comfort instead of growth. And a quiet question formed in his mind, one he could not ignore. Am I the one who never started, the one who endured the process, or the one who gave up? And for the first time in a long time, Ethan did not have an immediate answer, and that silence felt heavier than anything he had been running from. The next morning, Ethan woke up earlier than usual, not because he had somewhere important to be, but because his mind would not let him rest, the question from the night before still echoing quietly inside him. And as he sat at the edge of his bed, he reached for the 3 pencils on his table and held them again, this time more carefully, as if they meant something now, and he picked up the untouched one first, rolling it between his fingers, noticing how perfect it looked, smooth, clean, untouched by pressure or use. And for a moment, he thought about all the things he once wanted to try, the ideas he had, the plans he made but never followed through, and he whispered to himself, this one had potential, but it never did anything. Then he placed it down and picked up the sharpened pencil, its tip precise, its shape intentional, and he could almost imagine the process it went through, the pressure, the friction, the loss of its outer layer just to become useful. And he thought about the people he had seen succeed, how they seemed confident, capable, different, and for the first time, he wondered not what they had that he did not, but what they were willing to go through that he had been avoiding, and a quiet realization began to form, not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Maybe growth always costs something. Then his hand slowly moved to the last pencil, the broken one, shorter, worn, imperfect, and he stared at it longer than the others, because this one felt closest to him. This one felt honest, and he remembered the moments he had failed, the times he had tried and stopped, the times he convinced himself that quitting was easier than continuing, and he felt a weight in his chest, not heavy enough to break him, but enough to make him pause, and he asked himself, did I fail, or did I just stop? And that question stayed with him as he went through his day, walking through the same streets, seeing the same people, but feeling slightly different, like something inside him had shifted just enough to make him notice what he used to ignore. And later that afternoon, he sat alone at a small park bench, pulling the 3 pencils out again, placing them side by side, and for the first time, he did not see objects, he saw choices, he saw paths, and as the sun lowered slowly in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground, Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and whispered quietly, almost like he was admitting something to himself. I think I know which one I have been, but I still do not know which one I can become. And in that moment, something inside him did not feel broken anymore, just unfinished. That evening, Ethan returned home with a strange sense of awareness, like the world had not changed, but the way he was seeing it had begun to shift. And as he placed the 3 pencils back on his table, he no longer saw them as simple objects. He saw them as reflections of choices he had been making every single day without even realizing it. And he sat down quietly, resting his hands on the table, staring at them as if they were waiting for him to decide something important. And after a long moment, he picked up the untouched pencil again and said softly, "You were safe, but you never became anything." Then he placed it down and reached for the sharpened one, holding it more firmly this time, feeling its balance, its purpose, and he said, "You had to lose something to become useful." And those words stayed in the air longer than he expected, because for the first time, he was not just observing, he was understanding. And then his hand slowly moved toward the broken pencil, the smallest one, the one he had found on the street, and he hesitated before picking it up, almost like he was afraid of what it represented. But eventually he held it, turning it between his fingers, noticing that even though it was shorter, even though it had been damaged, it still had graphite inside. It still had the ability to write, and that thought stopped him completely, and he leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing as a new idea formed in his mind, one that felt simple but powerful. It is not useless, it just looks that way. And suddenly, something clicked, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, and he realized that he had been judging himself the same way, looking at his failures, his setbacks, his unfinished attempts, and deciding that they defined his value, when in reality, they only showed where he had stopped, not what he was capable of. And he stood up slowly, walking over to the kitchen counter, grabbing a small notebook that had been sitting untouched for weeks, and he brought it back to the table, placing it in front of him. And for a moment, he hesitated again, his old thoughts trying to return, telling him that it would not matter, that he would probably stop again, that nothing would change. But this time, he did not push those thoughts away. He simply acknowledged them. And then he looked down at the broken pencil in his hand and whispered, "Let me see if you can still write." And with a steady breath, he pressed the tip against the paper. And slowly, carefully, he began to write his first word. And as the faint line appeared on the page, something inside him shifted, because it was not about the word, it was not about the pencil, it was about the realization that he had been wrong about himself all along. And as he continued writing, one word after another, imperfect but real, Ethan did not feel fixed, he did not feel complete, but for the first time, he felt like he had started again. The next day, Ethan did not wake up with sudden confidence or a completely new life, but something inside him felt different, quieter but stronger, like a small decision had been made and it refused to be ignored. And as he sat at his table again, he looked at the notebook from the night before, flipping through the few uneven lines he had written, nothing impressive, nothing perfect, but real, and he picked up the broken pencil once more, holding it with a little more certainty this time, and without overthinking, he began to write again, slowly at first, then a little faster, letting his thoughts come out without judging them. And as the minutes passed, he noticed something simple but important. He was not focused on how good the writing was. He was focused on continuing, and that alone felt new to him, because before, he would have stopped the moment it did not feel right, the moment it was not perfect. But now he kept going, and later that morning, instead of staying inside, Ethan decided to step out, carrying the 3 pencils in his pocket like a quiet reminder. And as he walked through the same streets, he paid attention to small things he usually ignored: people opening shops, a man setting up chairs outside a cafe, someone practicing guitar on a corner, all doing something, all in motion. And he realized that none of them looked perfect, but they were still showing up, still doing the work. And that thought stayed with him as he reached a small public library nearby, a place he had not entered in years. And without fully planning it, he walked inside, the calm atmosphere wrapping around him as he moved between the shelves. And he paused in front of a section on personal development, something he would have once avoided, thinking it was not for him. But today he did not turn away. Instead, he picked a simple book and sat down at a table, opening it with the same broken pencil in his hand, underlining a sentence slowly as he read. And for the first time, he was not trying to prove anything to anyone, not even himself. He was simply allowing himself to grow, one small step at a time. And as the hours passed, Ethan noticed something else changing, not outside, but inside. The voice that used to tell him he could not do things was still there, but it was quieter now, less convincing, like it had lost some of its power. And in its place, another voice began to appear, softer but steady, saying, "Keep going." And as the afternoon light filtered through the windows, Ethan closed the book and looked down at the broken pencil again, realizing that it was not just about whether it could still write. It was about whether he would keep using it, whether he would keep showing up even when it felt small, even when it felt slow. And as he stood up to leave, slipping the pencil back into his pocket, he no longer felt like someone who had failed. He felt like someone who had finally decided not to stop. On the third day, Ethan returned to the same street where everything had started, the same bench, the same quiet corner of the city. But this time he was not carrying doubt the way he had before. He was carrying awareness. And as he approached the bench, he saw the old man sitting there again, just as calm as before, as if he had been waiting. And Ethan walked up slowly, taking the 3 pencils out of his pocket and holding them in his hand. And for a moment he did not speak, because he realized that the answer he was about to give was not just about the pencils. It was about who he had been choosing to be. And the old man opened his eyes gently and looked at him, not asking, just waiting. And Ethan took a breath and said, "I thought I was the broken one," his voice steady but honest, "the one that failed and stopped." And he paused, glancing down at the shortest pencil in his hand. "But I was wrong." And the old man nodded slightly, encouraging him to continue. And Ethan lifted the sharpened pencil next, holding it between his fingers. This one, it went through something. It lost part of itself, but it became useful because of it. And as he spoke, his voice carried a quiet realization, not something borrowed from someone else, but something he had discovered on his own. And then he held up the untouched pencil, looking at it one last time before speaking. "And this one, it looks perfect, but it has never done anything." And he let out a small breath, almost like he was letting go of something he had held onto for too long. And then he looked back at the old man and said, I do not want to be the one who never starts, and I do not want to be the one who stops halfway. His eyes clearer now, more certain than they had ever been. I want to be the one who is willing to change, even if it costs something. And for the first time, the old man smiled a little wider, not surprised, but satisfied, and he leaned forward slightly and said, Then you are no longer choosing what you are. You are choosing what you are becoming. And those words settled deeply inside Ethan, because they did not feel like advice. They felt like truth. And the old man continued, his voice calm but firm. A pencil does not decide its value when it is made. It decides it every time it is used. And Ethan looked down at the pencils again, understanding now that their meaning was never about their condition. It was about their purpose. And the old man added one final thought. You will still feel doubt. You will still face pressure. And you may even feel broken again. But none of that decides your worth. Only whether you continue does. And for a moment, everything became quiet, not empty, but clear, and Ethan nodded slowly, not because he had all the answers, but because he no longer needed them all at once. And as he turned to leave, he did not throw any of the pencils away. Instead, he placed all three back into his pocket, because now he understood that each one represented a part of the journey, not just a final state. And as he walked forward, his steps were not faster, but they were different. They carried intention, and for the first time, Ethan was not trying to prove that he was enough. He was simply choosing not to stop becoming. The days that followed did not feel extraordinary from the outside. Nothing dramatic changed. There were no sudden opportunities or instant success. But inside Ethan, something steady had taken root, something that refused to let him go back to the way he used to think. And each morning he returned to his table, picking up the same notebook, the same broken pencil, and he wrote, not because he felt inspired every time, but because he had made a decision to continue. And at first his words were simple, sometimes unclear, sometimes repetitive, but he did not stop. And as the days passed, he noticed a quiet shift, not in the quality of what he was writing, but in the way he approached it. He no longer waited to feel ready. He no longer needed everything to be perfect before he began. He simply started, and that small change began to affect other parts of his life as well. When he applied for new opportunities, he did it without overthinking every detail. When he spoke to people, he did not hold back as much, and when doubt appeared, as it still did, he did not let it decide his actions. He acknowledged it and kept moving. And one afternoon, as he sat in a small cafe with his notebook open, he overheard a conversation at the next table, someone talking about a job opening at a nearby company. And normally, Ethan would have listened quietly and convinced himself that it was not for him. But this time, he did something different. He introduced himself, his voice calm but slightly uncertain, and asked about the opportunity. And as the conversation continued, he realized that he did not need to be perfect to take a step forward. He only needed to be willing. And later that week, he walked into another interview, not with the pressure to prove his worth, but with the intention to show up fully. And as he sat across from the interviewer, he answered honestly, not trying to sound impressive, but speaking from what he had learned, from what he had been practicing. And when he left the building, he did not replay every word in his mind the way he used to. He simply accepted that he had done what he could and continued his day. And that evening, as he returned home, he placed the three pencils on his table again, looking at them with a quiet sense of understanding. The untouched one still reminded him of the path he chose not to take. The sharpened one reminded him that growth would always require effort and discomfort. And the broken one, the one he used every day, reminded him that imperfection did not mean the end. It meant there was still something left to give. And as he picked it up once more and continued writing, Ethan no longer saw himself as someone trying to become better. He saw himself as someone who had already begun. Weeks passed, and while Ethan's life still looked ordinary from the outside, something undeniable had begun to change beneath the surface, not in sudden leaps, but in steady, consistent steps that quietly reshaped the way he lived each day. And one morning, as he walked into the same office building where he had once stood holding a rejection letter, this time he was not there to hope for approval. He was there because he had been invited back, not because he had become perfect, but because he had become consistent. and as he sat in the waiting area, he reached into his pocket and felt the familiar shape of the broken pencil, smaller now from use, but still there, still working, and he realized something simple but powerful. The pencil had not become useful in a single moment. It became useful every time he chose to use it, and in that same way, he had not changed in one big decision. He had changed through many small ones, decisions to keep writing, to keep trying, to keep showing up even when it felt uncertain, and when his name was called, he stood up calmly and walked into the room, not with fear, not with pressure, but with clarity. And as the conversation began, he spoke honestly about his journey, not hiding his past doubts, but also not letting them define him. And for the first time, he noticed something different in the way people responded to him. They were not just listening to his words. They were feeling his presence, a quiet confidence that did not come from knowing everything, but from continuing despite not knowing. And when the interview ended, Ethan stepped outside into the daylight, taking a deep breath, not because he was relieved it was over, but because he knew something deeper had already happened. Regardless of the outcome, he had shown up as someone different. And later that day, as he sat again at his table, placing the 3 pencils in front of him, he noticed how their meaning had evolved. The untouched one no longer tempted him. It no longer represented safety. It represented a life left unused. The sharpened one no longer intimidated him. It represented growth through effort, something he now accepted. And the broken one, the one he had once thought was useless, had become the most important of all, because it reminded him that even after failure, even after doubt, there was always something left, always a way to continue. And as he picked it up once more and wrote another line in his notebook, Ethan no longer questioned whether he could change. He understood that change was already happening, one action at a time. And for the first time, he did not feel like he was chasing a better version of himself. He felt like he was building it. That night, Ethan sat quietly at his table, the room filled with a soft, steady silence that no longer felt empty, but calm. And in front of him lay the same 3 pencils, now worn in different ways, each carrying a meaning that had grown deeper with time. And he reached for the broken one again, holding it gently, noticing how much shorter it had become since the day he first picked it up. And yet it had written more than he ever expected. And as he opened his notebook, flipping through pages, filled with imperfect lines, crossed-out thoughts, and small ideas that had slowly turned into something clearer, he realized that none of it was wasted. Every word, every attempt, every moment he chose to continue had shaped something inside him that could not be seen, but could be felt. And he paused for a moment, looking down at the page, and a simple thought came to him, one that felt like the quiet answer to everything he had been searching for. I was never broken. I just stopped writing. And as he wrote those words down, slowly and carefully, he felt a sense of clarity that did not need to be explained, because it was something he had experienced, not something he had been told. And he leaned back slightly, taking a deep breath, not out of relief, but out of understanding. And in that moment, he no longer felt like someone trying to fix himself. He felt like someone who had accepted the process of becoming. And the next morning, Ethan returned once more to the same street, the same bench where he had met the old man. But this time, the bench was empty. There was no one waiting, no voice to guide him. And for a brief moment, he looked around as if expecting something. But then he smiled slightly, realizing that there was nothing left to be given, because everything he needed had already been shown to him. And as he stood there, he took the 3 pencils out of his pocket one last time, holding them in his hand. And after a quiet moment, he placed the untouched pencil gently on the bench, leaving it behind, not as something he lost, but as something he chose not to become. Then he looked at the sharpened one, turning it once in his fingers before placing it beside the first, understanding that growth would always be part of the journey, but it was not something he needed to hold on to every moment. And finally, he looked at the broken pencil, the smallest one, the one that had stayed with him through every step, and without hesitation, he slipped it back into his pocket, because this one was not a symbol anymore. It was a reminder. And as he turned and began to walk away, his steps, steady and unhurried, Ethan did not feel like he had reached the end of something. He felt like he had finally begun, and somewhere in the quiet rhythm of his movement, in the simple act of continuing forward, the story he once thought had stopped was still being written.